Right, everyone. Hi, so I think we'll get started. I want to give our speaker enough time and all of you enough time to answer questions. My name is Charlie Laidman. I'm here in the War Studies Department as a lecturer and have the privilege to welcome back our speaker here today. He is an alum of War Studies. He came here on a year abroad to study here, and then went on to a very illustrious career. So I think we can take a lot of credit for that, but not as much as he can himself. He has had a remarkable career already. He did his PhD at Ohio State. He was a recipient of the Fulbright Fellowship. He was a Guggenheim Fellow. He's just brought out a book today. So he's as well as making over here, he's also brought out a book, an edited book called White Nights: Pages of a Doctor's Notebook, and I'll let him sort of say a few words because it touches on some of the things which he is looking at today. And the book and the talk today is related to another book that Ian will have coming out soon with Oxford University Press, and it's the same title as this talk here, The Faustian Bargain. But we're delighted he's flown over here from Yale and the Grand Strategy Program where he's teaching there, and I'm sure you're all very much looking forward to his talk. So Ian will speak for about 45 minutes, and that should give us plenty of time for questions as well. So I hand over to Ian.
Terrific. Thanks, Charlie. Thanks everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to be back and be on this side of the podium. 11 years ago I was on that side. Thank you, Charlie, for the invitation. Thank you, Andrew, for setting this all up. It's really terrific to be here. So the subject of my talk today was the subject of my dissertation and now my forthcoming book with Oxford University Press, which is Secret Military Cooperation Between Germany and the Soviet Union in the Interwar Period. In our story today, I'm going to start with a plane crash here. So while the Allies were negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, ending the First World War, off in Paris, about 500 miles to the east in the new state of Lithuania, there was a 30-year-old German major named Fritz Schunke, who was sitting on a Lithuanian army base. He had been stationed in the Baltic region after the German conquest of the area, and he'd been left behind to supervise the return of German equipment after Germany's defeat in the First World War. Well, while sitting in his tiny cupboard of an office on this now Lithuanian army base, he heard some commotion out in the hallway. He went out to see a man dressed as a doctor being dragged down the aisle by a pair of Lithuanian guards. He recognized the man, and to his shock, the man was none other than Enver Pasha, the former Turkish Minister of Defense, apparently disguised as a doctor. He realized quite quickly that the Lithuanians had no idea who he was, and at night he snuck back into the base, to the prison on this military base, and managed to sneak a few words with Enver Pasha through the bars. Fritz Schunke had been stationed in Turkey for part of the war, and Enver Pasha recognized him. And he told the 30-year-old major that he had been in a plane crash, that he had been carrying a set of very, very secret documents from the German high command to the Soviet government in Moscow, and that if these documents were discovered, the First World War might reopen. The Allies might occupy Germany. Well, Major Schunke panicked a little bit, and then after a few moments of repose, he decided he was going to go out to the plane and destroy the documents. He hired a pair of mercenaries. They went out, they found the plane, the wreckage of the plane, got into the fuselage, found the documents, and destroyed them. And he went back the next night to tell Enver Pasha that his mission had been successful, the documents were destroyed. Well, the Pasha said, your mission isn't quite over yet. He said, eventually the Allies are going to discover who I am. Enver Pasha was wanted for war crimes in connection with the mass murder of Armenians during the war. He had a large bounty on his head. He said, "If they discover my identity, I'm going to tell them everything, so you better get me out of this prison cell." The 30-year-old major hatched a plan. He managed to convince some of the Lithuanian guards who were friends of his that this poor man who was masquerading as a doctor, even though they didn't know his identity and they thought he was suspicious, should be allowed to take walks in the garden near the base. He hired a pair of mercenaries, a former German pilot, and they arranged to have a plane parked near this garden. One day while Enver Pasha was on a stroll with a number of his guards, the plane rolled out from behind a copse of trees and took off across a flat space. The 50-something-year-old Enver Pasha took off at a dead run. The door on the side of the plane opened. He was dragged in by a pair of hands, and as bullets whizzed from the Lithuanian guards, the plane up and wheeled westward back to Germany. What on earth was Enver Pasha doing in Lithuania in 1919? The possibility of a new war breaking out? What was worth this risk? Well, as Schunke would find out, a project he would become intimately involved with, the German High Command was already plotting the next war, planning ahead, and they sought out Soviet cooperation in basically beginning a long-term program of rearmament aimed at overturning the European status quo that was already being formed at Versailles, some 500 miles to the west. This is the subject of my talk today. This is Enver Pasha. And the question of how much did this matter is really what I'm going to try to address and convince you of here today. How much did this secret pact, in several different dimensions, which I'll discuss, what role did it play in the origins, course, and conduct of the Second World War? Well, I argue that without it, in fact, we would not have had a Second World War in Europe, at least not in the form that it would eventually take. This is for three primary reasons. The first is that secret cooperation between Germany and the Soviet Union, especially in its first phase, from 1919 to 1933, provided the technological, personnel, and doctrinal tools necessary for Germany to overcome conventional deterrence that was then preserving the status quo in Europe. And what I mean by conventional deterrence is essentially the idea, John Mearsheimer has written the most on this, that states don't go to war with each other unless they see a clear path to victory. Germany had been largely demilitarized, demobilized after the First World War. They were surrounded by states with larger militaries, larger industrial bases. Germany needed to see a path to victory in order to launch the Second World War. And I argue that secret cooperation gave them the tools, particularly technological, to convince themselves they could launch a war successfully. Second were the political consequences of the pact, something I'll talk about towards the end. I argue that the secret alliance actually militarized Soviet and German politics in this period, with a lot of consequences in terms of how the war would actually begin in 1939. And finally, and most obviously, I think, there are essentially two pacts that I look at in my book. The first is this period of secret cooperation from 1919 to 1933, and the second is the much better-known Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. This is where Hitler and Stalin partitioned Poland between them, essentially marking the beginnings of the Second World War in Europe, as Britain and France declared war on Germany not long thereafter. I argue that the first phase of cooperation led directly to the second, quite clearly, if you look at the chronology. So again, the origins are tied to this much earlier phase, this much less well-known phase of cooperation. So why does it matter? Well, I think discussing the origins, course, and conduct of the Second World War is a worthwhile task in its own right. But I think there are also generalizable conclusions about the origins of war, the role of technology, conventional deterrence, verification regimes. There were inspectors all over Germany whose sole job was to prevent Germany from rearming, and they failed. And then also why competing states cooperate, and what that tends to look like in history. All right, so let's start with a little background. Go back to Fritz Schunke in 1919 here. At that moment, Schunke himself was completely shocked that the German High Command, what was left of it, would be trying to negotiate with the Bolsheviks in Moscow. And why was that? Well, the German officer corps despised communism and the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks kind of returned the favor emotionally here. So in the same year that they began negotiating, Lenin in public speeches was called the German military, quote, savages, plunderers, predators, and note that in the First World War, the German robbers broke all records in war atrocities. The German officer corps were about as fond of the Bolsheviks. One senior German general only referred to Lenin and Trotsky as the devil in his writings, rather than by name. Another German veteran and Reichswehr non-commissioned officer, the Reichswehr being the Weimar Republic's military, wrote that, quote, the rulers of present-day Russia are common blood-stained criminals. They are the scum of humanity, which, favored by circumstances, overran a great state in a tragic hour, slaughtered and wiped out thousands of her leading intelligentsia with wild bloodlust, and now for almost 10 years have been carrying on the cruelest and most tyrannical regime of all time. This was more or less the common one among German military officers. So why on earth would two regimes, which viewed each other as the literal embodiment of evil, form a secret alliance to aid each other in their strategic aims? The reason was the nature of the post-war order after the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles, which had ended Germany's participation in the First World War, led to Germany's forceful disarmament. Foreign troops occupied its industrial heartland. The victorious Allies completely dismantled the vaunted Imperial German Army, reducing it to only 100,000 men, only 4,000 of whom could be officers, a tiny fragment of the wartime army. And Germany was further banned from possessing the major technologies of war: tanks, military aircraft, submarines, chemical weapons. These were all proscribed, a set of terms that were enforced by teams of inspectors sent to roam Germany's industrial facilities. Meanwhile, in 1919, the Soviet Union was not technically in existence yet. The Bolshevik Revolution was in the midst of a desperate fight for survival against an enormous coalition of allies and White Russian forces. It was not until the fall of 1919 that it would become apparent that the Bolsheviks might actually survive and form a regime. And even once they emerged victorious in 1920, they faced a very stark strategic landscape. Complete strategic isolation. Poland, in fact, invaded the country from the east in this part of 1920. The country was suffering from a massive famine. There were cholera and typhus epidemics on enormous scales, and industrial production was almost zero. It was in this moment of isolation and desperation that the two pariah states began to exchange military envoys, intelligence, and technology. And the first time that this would happen would be when Enver Pasha finally did make it to Moscow to hand over documents in 1920. It took him 3 trips, but he finally got there. Both states initially exchanged information over the new state of Poland, which had been created by the Treaty of Versailles. Both regimes hated Poland. Molotov would put it perhaps most ineloquently when he called Poland that monstrous bastard of Versailles. And the two regimes would remain united in their hatred of Poland throughout the interwar period, coming together again to destroy Poland in 1939. After this initial exchange of information and intelligence against the Poles, they would begin holding secret military conferences. And by they, I'm talking about the Red Army, but with the acquiescence of their government, and the German military without the knowledge of their government. The German military was essentially pursuing its own foreign policy at this juncture. Their first conference was in the summer of 1921. In April 1922, Soviet Russia and Weimar Germany signed the Treaty of Rapallo, which normalized diplomatic relations between the two states, the first time that Soviet Russia had been recognized internationally. 5 months later, People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs Leon Trotsky and German General Hans von Zect would formalize an arrangement to initiate secret cooperation. This had a series of aspects, which I'll discuss here. So what were their aims, first of all, in 1920 when they came together? So we have Zect on the left and Trotsky in his military uniform on the right. Well, Hans von Zect, commanding the Reichswehr, the Weimar Republic's military, saw the Soviet Union as a logical partner in rewriting the European status quo. His aim, which is remarkably clear from strategic documents even before the Treaty of Versailles had been signed, was to set a long-term plan in motion to launch a new war against France and Poland as soon as circumstances permitted. This was aimed at recovering lost German territories in the east and destroying the hated Treaty of Versailles. He had 3 means to accomplish that end. The first was to relocate all these banned military industries that the Allies were trying to destroy to the Soviet Union, to rebuild entire military industries safe from Allied eyes inside of Soviet Russia. There, German engineers could retain their skills and build up stockpiles of weapons for Germany to use in the next war. Next, Seykt foresaw that German officers, that tiny group of 4,000 men, should be trained on the most advanced technologies of war. He actually saw the small size of the German officer corps as a possible advantage, in that every German officer could be trained to master all of the new technologies of war that Seykt thought would be decisive in the next war. And there were three in particular that he was obsessed with: air power, armored vehicles, and chemical weapons. The Soviet Union would allow a place for officers to learn how to use these various technologies of war with the actual equipment at hand. So prior to opening the secret facilities on Soviet soil, this is how the Germans practiced armored warfare. These are cardboard cutouts, and the exercises were less than useful. Finally, Seykt sought to develop the new technologies of war themselves. Germany had not really begun mass-producing tanks at the end of the war, but he was convinced that they would be critical in the next conflict. Same was true of aircraft and submarines. They could no longer develop prototypes in Germany. They needed a safe place to do this, and the Soviet Union might offer that possibility. So how about Trotsky? What was he aiming to get out of this arrangement? So he was the head of the Red Army until 1925. Up to that point, his primary goals were to rebuild a devastated Soviet Union with German help and capital. Soviet military industry was almost completely destroyed during the Russian Civil War, and he aimed to have German engineers help rebuild those factories. This would have the added benefit of increasing the size of the Soviet working class, one of the fundamental goals of the regime. In addition, the Red Army was in terrible state after the Russian Civil War had ended. There were about 5.5 million men ostensibly in the Red Army, but only 600,000 uniforms and a comparable number of weapons. Trotsky wanted help professionalizing this force, training, building them up. He had another problem in that most of the officers left after the Russian Civil War were actually Tsarist-era officers who were not trusted politically. And he wanted German help to develop working-class, loyal communist officers who could replace them. As a result of this alignment of interests, the two sides would begin building a network of facilities inside the Soviet Union. And here we see the major facilities. I'm going to talk about all of these at least a little bit today. The first phase of cooperation saw the construction of Fili, an aviation plant in the suburbs of Moscow, and Bersal, a chemical weapons plant near Samara in central Russia. This element of cooperation would continue fitfully until 1941 or so, which was aimed at bringing German corporations into the Soviet Union to develop Soviet military industry and also to build these stockpiles of weapons that Seykt sought. These facilities provided employment for German engineers, scientists, and technicians, preserving a core of know-how. They were also able to test and develop new prototypes at these various facilities. The scale of industrial cooperation between these two states grew to staggering proportions, most of it mediated by the German military, which set up its own secret unofficial embassy in Moscow, where German corporate officials could meet with the Red Army and with Soviet government officials and hash out deals. So in the 1920s alone, the Red Army would negotiate contracts with 255 German corporations, almost all of them through the mediation of the Reichswehr. These contracts included nearly every major industrial firm in Germany, all of whom were in on the secret of cooperation. Soviet-German trade would actually peak at 1 billion marks in 1931, a year in which German goods accounted for about half of all Soviet imports. The vast majority of those were, in fact, pieces of equipment to develop military industry for the Soviet regime. So closely tied were German military industry and the Soviet state, something I found quite remarkable, that German engineers were actually often issued Red Army officers' uniforms when they arrived at the Soviet borders to assist them in their work building up Soviet military industry. They played a critical role in building some of the central showpieces of Stalin's first five-year plan, places like the Fili aviation plant, the largest aircraft manufacturing facility in Russia, and Bolshevik Factory Number 232 in Leningrad, which manufactured tanks and artillery. So how important was this partnership in providing the military industry that the Soviet Union would rely upon in the Second World War? One number, I think, provides an answer. I'm happy to provide more, but one, I think, is quite stark. In 1940, 55% of all Soviet tank production was dependent on German-built, designed, or managed factories. And 97% of all Soviet tank production was drawn from foreign designs, most of them acquired through German assistance. Now, as corporate cooperation took off in this period, and we can see here one of the military-industrial facilities staffed by Germans, the German military also sought the means to expand direct military-to-military cooperation. And there were several different aims of this program, one of which was to train junior officers in the German military. The first of these arrangements centered on restoring German air power. In 1923, Hans von Zech began to dispatch German pilots to a Soviet air base near Lipetsk. This is the base in the late 30s. There they were their job was essentially to train junior Soviet pilots, and in exchange they were allowed flying time and access to Soviet aircraft so that these combat veterans of the First World War could retain their skills. It was fairly successful in its 2 years of operation, so the German military under Zech acquired the base on a lease, actually, from the Soviet government in 1925. The deal was that if the Germans would train Soviet pilots and mechanics and allow Soviet technicians access to any material at the airbase, the Germans could do whatever they wanted at this airfield. And what Zech wanted to do was to train large numbers of officers and test new aircraft. More than 1,000 Germans would pass through flight school at Lipetsk during its years of operation. For context, that's about the entire size of the officer corps of the Luftwaffe when it was reconstituted in 1935. Almost every single officer either taught, lived, or studied at some point at this base. In fact, 22 of the officers who would achieve the rank of general by 1941 were in fact alumni of this facility. One image that I've also found a little funny in the archives. So in order to disguise their presence in Russia, and just in case they were caught, all German officers were instructed to behave as tourists. They were given tourist visas. They were told to arrive in plain clothes at the border. Now, of course, these gentlemen don't look much like tourists, and there aren't a lot of tourists who are headed to the Soviet Union in 1927 in any case. But what's particularly striking to me is that they're all wearing military boots and that they've lined up in order of height, which is what you would do on a parade ground. They were not particularly subtle. Interestingly, one addenda here, Zech very much was a long-term planner. And his calculation was that the next major world war was about 15 to 20 years away. He thought it was likely to start between 1940 and 1945. So with that in mind, the youngest possible officers were sent to the Soviet Union. And in fact, they would begin essentially taking volunteers as young as 17 or 18 years old to train at Lipetsk starting in 1927. The aim was that these junior officers would be the perfect age to command squadrons in the next war, doing the math out in terms of age. On a technological level, too, this facility played a central role in the future of German air power. There were 8 aviation firms in Germany in 1922, after the war. 7 of them dispatched all of their prototypes to Lipetsk for testing that had any military utility. Almost every single one of Germany's aircraft designers who would design aircraft in the Second World War was working on aircraft at this facility. One of the most striking examples, I think, of the impact of this facility was the Bf-109. This was the main German fighter of the Second World War. It's the second most produced aircraft of all time, in fact. Its specifications were drawn up by the head of research, Wilhelm Wimmer, at Lipetsk. And its chief designer had, in fact, designed his first 3 aircraft for this facility. Essentially, without the experience, the ability to test prototypes at this facility, the German designer in question, Walter Rethel, would simply not have been able to develop the Bf-109. Now, the Soviets were ostensibly more concerned with training officers than testing new technologies. After all, they had the whole Soviet Union to fly aircraft if they so wanted. But there was a certain allure to German technology. And German reports back from this base are full of these anecdotes about locks mysteriously broken at night on hangars and warehouses. Although technically the Soviets were allowed access to anything at the facility, in theory they were also supposed to pay patent dues or rights to German firms bringing their prototypes into the country. Lenin and Trotsky weren't necessarily big fans of paying those fees to German firms, and so they simply ordered military intelligence to break into facilities at night, disassemble various component systems, take photographs, and put them back together. Ostensibly, the Germans wouldn't know. Of course, the Germans noted that a lot of the equipment was really shoddily put back together in the morning. They obviously knew what was happening, and so it meant they couldn't use it. But it was clear that the Soviets were, in fact, getting large amounts of technology as part of this exchange. The most striking is the fact that in the mid-1930s, after Hitler had come to power, one German air firm, Junkers, would actually sue the Soviet government for copyright infringement for replicating a plane that he had tested at Lipetsk in the 1920s. This was obviously a huge embarrassment, and they really quickly tried to bury this lawsuit, but it's a sign of how aggressively the Soviets were borrowing military technology from the Germans. Now, a year after the founding of Lipetsk, the two sides agreed to a new facility, codenamed Kama. This was designed to be a joint armored warfare testing ground and training facility. Operating for 7 years, the training facility hosted the most prominent theorists of armored warfare in the interwar period, people like Heinz Guderian, Ernst Volkheim, and Mikhail Tukhachevsky. The school was a lot smaller than Lipetsk. It only trained 30 German officers, but 17 of them would reach the rank of division commander or above in the German military. Again, to put this into perspective, there were 18 armored divisions in the German army in 1941, 17 of them commanded by alumni of this facility. On the Soviet side, there were about 187 Soviet officers who would complete the course, and they essentially staffed every major training facility for armored warfare in the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, most of them would be caught up in the purges that began in 1936 and would have a somewhat limited impact as a result, but these were people of very senior rank. Now, Kama would have perhaps even greater significance on German tank design. These are two of the prototypes that would be first tested there. So until 1926, Allied inspectors were stationed at all the major armaments factories across Germany. Tank production was banned, and it was very strictly regulated. So conducting large-scale work in Germany was simply impossible. But the major firms were very interested in getting an early jump start on tank development, and all agreed to secret contracts for the Reichswehr in 1926. Daimler, Krupp, MAN. Porsche, by the way, was actually started to send prototypes to Kama as an independent firm. Interestingly, these vehicles, again, there was a sense that these needed to be disguised on their way to the Soviet Union. And so this vehicle right here, the Großtraktor, you can see it's got a 37 millimeter cannon. German military intelligence decided they would just weld a tractor plow on the front of it and hope that it got through inspections at Allied inspection posts on the Soviet border. Somehow it did. Apparently they didn't notice the big cannon sticking out there. So unlike Lipetsk, where prototypes were sent and the reports sent back to Germany, these German firms working on tank design decided that the work was too dangerous to conduct anything inside of Germany's borders. So they simply dispatched their entire design bureaus to the Soviet Union. Daimler and Krupp, the two largest, sent teams of 12 to 15 engineers, including their chief designers, to live at this military facility. The two senior engineers would rotate back every once in a while to meet with the Reichswehr's weapons testing office, and they would do so an enormous number of times. 64 meetings between June 1931 and July 1933, some of them lasting up to a week. Their job was to draw up the next generation of armored vehicles, again with this new war in mind. Among the things that they discuss, which are quite evident looking at the archival material, is the fact that they were borrowing Soviet technology quite aggressively, often without the Soviets knowing. One thing they were particularly impressed by was what became known as the three-man turret. It was a piece of technology on the Red Army's T-28. So in early tank designs, like the LAS here, the turret essentially was just big enough for the commander to sit in the turret. And so he had to load the gun, he had to fire it, and he had to issue commands to his radio operator and driver inside the vehicle. There's a lot of multitasking for one man. The T-28's larger turret actually allowed space for 3 men, allowing the commander to simply issue orders and leave the firing and the loading to other men. The consequence was that the Germans quickly discovered that a 3-man turret could fire about 5 times as fast as a 1 or 2-man turret. And interestingly, the Soviets were never quite as fond of this design, and in fact, they would not continue to use it on their tank designs. Neither did the French nor the British. As a result, if you look at French reports from 1940, when the Germans crossed the border, they noted that the Germans were capable of firing 5 to 6 times faster than they were, something that had a decisive impact in the Battle of France in May 1940. Kama's impact on future German tank design, I think, is hard to exaggerate. So the prototype testing and doctrinal changes at Kama, as well as some of these technological changes like the 3-man turret, led directly to the Panzers 1, 2, 3, and 4. Essentially every tank that Germany built up through the summer of 1942. Now, the last set of facilities I'm going to talk about today were the most secretive. And those are the chemical weapons plants and laboratories. Now, the Allies had completely dismantled the German chemical weapons program after the First World War. In fact, they considered putting every major German scientist on a war crimes list and actually began sending out teams to hunt them down. For a variety of reasons, that did not end up happening. But as early as 1921, Fritz Haber, a Nobel Prize winner who had played a major role in the German chemical weapons program, had begun sending some of his subordinates to the Soviet Union, helping them get contracts to move and to take jobs with the Red Army. As a result, there was a fairly well-developed network even before cooperation really became quite so extensive. Again, with an eye towards maintaining expertise and developing new deployment techniques in particular, new technologies to use chemical weapons, Zeke and Trotsky arranged to surreptitiously relocate essentially the entire German World War I era chemical weapons program to 2 secret bases, one just outside of Moscow and another in a much more rural part of Russia along the Volga River. The site near Moscow would shut down fairly quickly as they discovered some of the testing was not particularly safe for a suburb of a major city, unfortunately. And so most of the work would actually be done at this other facility called Tomka. And we can see here about 30 German chemists and various designers at their base. Interestingly, many of these chemical weapons experts had been university faculty who had been essentially conscripted into the German military during the First World War to work on this project. A lot of them had gone back to the universities. So one thing that's quite striking, you can't really tell from this picture, but many of them brought their graduate students with them to this secret facility beginning in 1926. And the poor graduate students had a little bit of a rough time because if they needed to test a new technology, if they needed to test a new agent, they would often use the graduate students as guinea pigs, which my advisor said I should be very grateful after she read that part of my dissertation. The Germans, as part of the price for having access to these facilities, being able to send their research teams, would assist the Soviets in massively expanding their own chemical weapons program. By 1931, the Germans were managing about half of all of Soviet chemical weapons production in the country. You can see the growth of the Soviet program was quite extraordinary. By 1938, the Soviets had the largest production capacities in the world.
What's the scale on the bottom scale? Is that years?
This is the number of facilities.
So you can't see it properly.
Yeah. So let me talk a little bit about the doctrinal impact here. I argue in my book, and I'm happy to discuss this more in the questions and answers, that joint testing at these various facilities, where the Soviets and Germans worked very much hand in glove, they ate the same messes, they spent an inordinate amount of time together, but their testing together would actually convince both militaries against the first use of chemical weapons in the Second World War. And the reason for this, if you look at what they were actually doing at this secret facility, they're centered on one thing. And that's the idea that you can use chemical agents in conjunction with strategic air power. They really wanted to see if you could essentially strategic bomb enemy cities with chemical agents of a variety of different types. And it turned out the answer was not very effectively. They tested this over and over again. They built replica cities based, my understanding is largely on Warsaw, which tells you a little bit, to test these strategic bombing techniques. And the reports going back to Germany said this simply was not going to work unless the planes flew so low that they would likely be shot down. I think this had a big impact on the way chemical weapons would not be used in the Second World War. Let me turn now to some of the larger takeaways from this project. As I've tried to lay out here, Germany was completely dependent on these secret facilities in the Soviet Union for its own rearmament. I noticed something as I was pouring through the records, particularly the various pieces of equipment that were being developed here. Looking at how cooperation shaped these engineering cadres leads to, I think, a pretty stark conclusion. So during the interwar period, it takes an average of 4 years to develop an armored vehicle or aircraft frame, from specifications to mass production, and another year or two to reach peak mass production. This is a process that really cannot be sped up unless there's a great deal of capital investment or there's some sort of breakthrough. But across almost all states in Europe, this is the norm. Engine systems take about 6, with again about 2 years to reach maximum production threshold. And these are numbers taken from Adam Tooze's book, The Wages of Destruction, where he breaks this down. So if you look at basically the role of testing in the Soviet Union, so we can see here these are the various German pieces of equipment being developed, and these are the different phases of their technological development. The Reichswehr issuing specifications, building the first prototype, testing that prototype, entering mass production, and then reaching peak efficiency of mass production. So we can see all these prototypes that didn't quite reach mass production potential here, but if you notice, they all start around the same time, 1926, when all of these various facilities opened in the Soviet Union. Now, when Hitler came to power, he very rapidly shed the restrictions of Versailles in about an 18-month period between 1933 and 1935. This essentially stopped paying attention to all of the restrictions on military production. What this meant was that the German military commissioned an enormous number of new pieces of technology, new weapon systems, simultaneously between 1933 and 1935. Again, because of all of the work done in the Soviet Union, they had prototypes, they had the engineering expertise to build very good weapon systems. These were not weapon systems that were significantly behind the French or British or Soviets. Now, in most states, this process of technological procurement it's not all conducted at once. There are a number of different systems undergoing development at different phases of development at the same time. But because of the Treaty of Versailles and then the nature of cooperation and then Hitler shedding the restrictions of Versailles very suddenly, every major weapon system used by the Wehrmacht in the opening phases of the Second World War was simultaneously reaching maturity between 1939 and 1941. Now, what this means is that Germany's maximum potential technologically was in this opening phase of the war. I think this explains at least a little bit the nature of German successes, and it's something that the Germans themselves were very aware of, from what I can see. What I think this did is it helped break down this idea of conventional deterrence. Officers like Heinz Guderian believed that these new technologies, and just as importantly, the doctrine and officers who could put them to best effect, they had found a recipe by which they could defeat the British, the French, the Soviets, and overturn the European order, their fundamental strategic goal. Now, in addition to its technological and economic impacts, the secret alliance also impacted the lives of both states. I had mentioned this militarization process at the very beginning of my talk. Trotsky, who was one of the architects of the secret alliance between the two states, would actually be forced out of his management of the military in part as a result of the pact with Germany. There were a number of reasons for this. Again, I'm happy to discuss them more in Q&A. But this was actually, it was part of Stalin's stepping stones towards total power, was essentially discrediting Trotsky over this issue. Once he had actually cemented himself in power by 1929, however, he would expand cooperation rather than shrink it. And in fact, he would take the advice of a number of mid-ranking Soviet officers, including Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who studied very closely with the Germans, on the need for a massive mechanized Red Army. And as a result, in the first 3 5-year plans, Soviet military expenditures would rise drastically, drawn up in large part by Mikhail Tukhachevsky and the pro-German faction of the Red Army. For Germany, the role is perhaps more obvious, more directly connected. The Soviet-German military pact played a clear role in the rise of Nazism. The German military, again, its goal this entire period had been to overturn Versailles, to build a new order, to defeat Poland. Goals the Nazis were very amenable to. In addition, the Soviet-German facilities were paid out of a black fund. I had mentioned the German government was not usually aware of the ongoing cooperation of the specific elements. The German facilities were actually paid out of these secret funds that were drawn from illegal weapons sales around the world. These black funds would actually be diverted to Nazi candidates for Reichstag in the late 1920s, under the understanding that the Nazis were likely to support some of the various political goals of the senior German military cadres. In addition, the experience of actually living in the Soviet Union, and a significant number of German officers did, had a contradictory effect, both of which actually played an impact on the rise of Nazism. So Werner von Blomberg, pictured here, who was one of the architects of Hitler's coming to power, probably the single most dedicated Nazi officer in the early into mid-30s. He actually describes in the first draft of his memoirs in the late 30s that his experience living in the Soviet Union convinced him totalitarianism was the way to go. He'd seen the enormous amount of resources the Soviet state could bring to bear on rearmament and the Red Army, and he thought that the only way Germany would restore itself to Weltmacht, to world power, was by copying the Soviet totalitarian model. This had a big impact on his dedication to Nazism. On the other end of the scale, those young 17 and 18-year-olds I told you about, the pilots in training, they lived in Lipetsk, which was at the heart of what became known as the famine zone. When Stalin began collectivization and confiscating grain from the peasants, Lipetsk was at the heart of an area where something like 5 million peasants would starve to death. These young officers, again, at a very critical age of development, would see starving peasants trying to climb over the barbed wire fences of their camp and being shot down by guards, by Soviet guards. And it's something you can see from their own diaries and experiences clearly turn them against the Soviet regime in very different ways than their senior officers. And finally, the last portion here, the second pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. So a great deal more has been published on this than the earlier portions of my talk. But what I think is not properly understood is how important the earlier phase of cooperation was in establishing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. From the Soviet perspective, the pact marked the renewal of military cooperation, not some sudden about-face in Soviet policy. In fact, 8 months before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, according to my research, Voroshilov, who was then the Commissar for Defense, sent the Politburo a list of purchases requested from the German military. Again, this is at a moment when there's a war scare, there's a sense that Soviet Union and Germany may come to blows. But this report is a series of requests to purchase equipment from German military industrial firms. The Soviets had essentially become dependent on German aid and assistance in this period. The list is over 17 pages, includes 112 different technologies of war, including a variety of machine tools, but also entire weapon systems, engines. In fact, they would request an entire battle cruiser to be purchased from Krupp. This was a central impetus for Stalin in August 1939 when he would enter negotiations with the Germans. In fact, under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which again marked the partition of Poland and marked the beginning of the Second World War in Europe, the Soviet Union would provide Nazi Germany with 1 million tons of grain, 900,000 tons of petroleum, 500,000 tons of phosphates, and much more. That's often noted in the history books. What isn't as often noted is the enormous amount of military material that went the other way. A lot of these contracts that had been initiated long before and were now renewed in 1939. In addition, Stalin actually allowed Hitler to build another base on Soviet soil in 1939, something that, again, has, I think, been largely forgotten. They were allowed to set up a submarine base near Murmansk, a site called Zapadnaya Litsa. This marked a resumption in both industrial terms and in military terms, not a sudden about-face by the Soviet government. So just in very last conclusion here, I argue secret cooperation in the interwar period was an essential prerequisite for the rearmament of both Germany and the armament of the Soviet Union in this period, and then their partition of Eastern Europe, which marked the beginnings of the Second World War. Given its role in rearming the German state, militarizing both regimes, and inaugurating the invasion of Poland, the Second World War, I argue, really could not have happened, at least in the form that it took, without secret cooperation. With that, I will conclude and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Faye. It was a real tour de force, and I'm sure it's going to provoke a lot of questions. I'm going to take the privilege of the chair just to ask the first question, and then we'll open it up to broader questions. First, I was going to say, there was, as you mentioned at the beginning, there's so much that comes out of this research that touches on such big questions in the larger literature. And the one that I was going to ask you about was the role of leaders and how the context sort of shapes policies, and particularly what Hitler's reaction was when he came to power. Because obviously this is all very secret. This has all been established by institutions, and it's sort of going as you show, particularly with Germany, that it goes across different regimes, from a more democratic regime to an authoritarian regime. But then when you get Hitler coming to power, extremely anti-communist, anti-Soviet, and then finds out that Germany's been collaborating with the Soviet Union, obviously for ends that he agrees with in terms of rearming. But can you say a bit more about his immediate reaction and how his attitude to this collaboration with the Soviets evolves over that period?
Sure, yeah. So this is a very badly kept secret in some ways. There are a series of reports that get out. One of them published by a very entrepreneurial journalist from the Manchester Guardian in 1926, which actually brings down a German government when it's discussed in the Reichstag. So pieces are leaking out the whole time, but no one really has a good sense of the scope or scale of all of this cooperation. And Hitler is among the people who has a sense that there are some things going on. So his so-called second book, which he wrote in 1929, has 2 chapters on military cooperation with the Soviet Union in it. And again, it wasn't published at the time, but he clearly had a sense that some things were going on, and he thought it was a really bad idea, in part because of his rabid anti-communism. When he comes to power, most of these secret facilities are no longer necessary, and that you can bring back the military technology, bring back the personnel. But interestingly, he doesn't close all the facilities immediately. He actually keeps one open, or a channel open, on submarine cooperation. I think he's concerned about alienating the British, and so he keeps that design bureau for another 2 years. It will be tied to the Soviet government. So there's really only a gap of about 3.5, 4 years in cooperation under Hitler. And of course, he's going to see it very differently. The German High Command sees this alliance as a permanent one. They don't intend to betray the Soviet Union. They see it as strategic depth for Germany. Obviously, Hitler has a very different vision. But it's something that he's frankly kind of obsessed with in the 1920s.
Yes.
2 points. I was intrigued by your comment that SEEK was planning for world conquest as late as 1918. I think is what one would suggest. Because the bit that's always puzzles me, has done for some years now, is covered by Adam Roos when he talks about resources available to Germany, problems with manufacturing steel without the benefit of the Swedish iron ore fields, that sort of thing. And the fact that Germany, throughout the Second World War, was always short of equipment suitable for the purpose. I mean, you could either build 88mm guns for protecting German cities, or you could use them out on the Eastern Front, or blowing our people apart in the Western Desert. There were choices there. Same is true of the use of armour. You could build big tanks, or you could build small ones. You could build roads. Do you get the impression that SEEK perhaps has no real awareness of this? I mean, I suspect it's a very good operations commander or general, but not necessarily a strategic commander. Is that a reasonable? Strategists perhaps would say to account, you have to take all the elements of war fighting. I suppose my final point was, at which point did the German government realise that the main enemy at the end of the day would be the United States? I often knew that, but I'm sorry. Some of the stuff's new to me, so I'm picking bits and pieces out of it. And if you can't answer, I'd be perfectly content to leave it at that.
Sure. Well, let me start by noting the evidence that I have that Zeke is very dedicated to this vision is actually it's quite a strategic document. Essentially, in the context of the Polish Bolshevik War, he's having a conversation with his senior officers about whether or not they should invade Poland from the West, which is obviously what will happen eventually in 1939. And he decides no, in part for a variety of strategic reasons: lack of resources, the state of German politics, etc. And so he says we need to wait, we need to get strong, and then we will do exactly this. The partition of Poland. And interestingly, orders sent from his office to, say, Krupp, for instance, in the early 20s, are actually requiring that all tanks be built so they can go on French roads and on Belgian and French railroads, that their weight will function on those rail gauges. So obviously they're thinking very offensively in both directions very early without the strategic and economic resources to make that happen. I think his vision is that the Soviet Union will provide all of these resources, that it will become a sort of appendage of a militarized German state. I think he hoped, and a lot of the officer corps did as well, there would be some sort of military dictatorship established in Germany rather than what they consider a very soft Weimar Republic. In terms of the United States, their hatred of the Poles is just constant in everything that they're doing. They actually, when they're test firing even artillery pieces at the Joint Ranges, they're putting the dummies in Polish uniforms, which seems pretty spiteful. I don't see really, the thought is always they want to fight a war against France and Poland and keep Great Britain out if they can, and hopefully the U.S. won't get involved, that they can win very quickly. But the long-term strategic planning is not very evident there.
No. Thank you.
So I think we have one question
from the audience.
From the audience, yeah. Yes.
So one asked, Dr. Johnson, do you think there were particular attitudes in the German officers that inclined them to think that totalitarianism, as he put it, was the way to go?
Absolutely, yeah. So I've mentioned Blomberg's attitudes, and he credits Stalinism and his experience with the Red Army with his devotion to Nazism in part. With more junior officers, it's different. I think the experience really foments a very strong sense of anti-communism, and there are two ways that this happens. One, they see the famine. They're writing back, they're writing in their diaries that they're seeing these masses of starved peasants in the train stations and on the roads. And then in addition, they train with a very large number of Soviet officers. Many of the German officers are going to actually speak pretty good Russian by the time they leave. They have a lot of friends on the other side. And then in 1936, the purges come. And the Soviet officer corps is wiped out. And anyone who had connections with the German military is gone, almost everyone. Even the janitors and wait staff at the cafeteria at the airfield were arrested in this process of purges. And as a result, these German officers, who had actually, some of them had kept up correspondence with their Soviet counterparts, all of these friends that might have humanized the enemy are suddenly gone. And I think if you look at the behavior of a lot of these officers on the Eastern Front, the Rasenkrieg, the race war, how horrific it becomes, it's in part the experience, the loss of these friends, and also what they've seen, the horrors of Stalinism. So I think it plays a big role.
I'll collect a couple of questions, if that's okay. So one question here.
Very fascinating. Why have historians not brought this to the fore before?
Okay, that's the first one. Second question here.
I believe that the T-34 tank was based on the US Christie. Did that come back because of its hiatus in the relationship that the Soviets basically looked elsewhere for their impetus, and obviously the effect that had on the war?
Yeah.
Can we say a third, or do you answer those two and then we'll...
Right. Yes, so the Soviets they're excellent at this period. They've got procurement officers all over the world looking for good pieces of technology, particularly ones they think have been neglected by other countries. So the Christie chassis and the basis for the T-34 comes from the United States in part, and it's a design the U.S. military is not very enthusiastic about, and the Soviets leap on the chance. The Germans aren't directly involved, though the Germans do comment. It's quite remarkable. They do have access to laboratories during this period, and they visit Soviet aviation and armored warfare testing grounds, and there are entire rooms just devoted to taking apart foreign equipment and rebuilding it. And it particularly is coming from the United States and from Germany. So absolutely, there's some overlap. In terms of why it hasn't been written about more, the big reason is that the Soviet archives were largely closed on this subject until quite recently. So until 1980.
When exactly were they opened?
Yeah, so 1991, the archives, there's kind of this suddenly access is available. So a fair amount had been written after the Second World War, kind of about diplomatic cooperation, but without some of the focus on technology and actually what was happening at these bases. They were kind of treated as black boxes because there weren't good transcripts, there weren't good documents. So what I did is I did something I think that was novel on the German side, in that I went to all the corporate archives, and I looked at actually what their engineers were doing, the reports they were sending back. And they were quite vocal about what the daily routine was like, what they were working on, all these pieces of technology. On the Soviet side, no one has really fully dived into the Soviet archives on this, at least I think until this project, with one exception. There was a diplomatic historian, he's actually in the foreign ministry, named Sergei Gorlov, who wrote a book about this in the mid-1990s. But because he had official status with the Russian government, he wasn't allowed to go to the German archives, is my understanding. And so he got half the story, and which is terrific, but really no one has put both the German and Soviet halves together, I think, until this project.
Yes, one question here, and is there a question? No, is the first question here? Yeah.
Well, first, thank you very much. Since both armies had the opportunity to work each other, I assume that they also took the advantage to gather intelligence on each other.
Mm-hmm.
Does this have a big influence on, like, on the one hand, how the Germans, on the tactical point of view, I think more planned Barbarossa, and how the Russians planned their response to Barbarossa? I mean, all the knowledge they had acquired on how armies fought and on the material they were using?
Absolutely. So the Soviets are very actively spying on every single German officer who's in the country. I've gathered, I was fortunate to find in one of the regional archives that I visited a collection of KGB documents that were actually classified and weren't accessible anywhere else, but this regional archive happened to have some copies. And these were detailed dossiers on all of the German pilots and mechanics who were in the country, their sexual habits, what they were reading, their gambling issues, every possible detail to look at, well, what's the German military going to do when they have to fight the Soviet Union? Are they going to be politically loyal? So the Soviets are thinking about this very clearly. The Germans, there's a lot of hubris on the German side, a sense that we should have won the First World War and that the Soviets were so far behind in terms of the officers they were encountering. The first wave of German officers who are stationed in these various military academies, a lot of the Soviet officers they're dealing with are basically illiterate. They're these working class or peasants who have been promoted into the Red Army in the Civil War. And so they kind of disdain them. And I think in part as a result they underestimate the Red Army, its resilience, its capabilities. In terms of doctrine and tactics and operations, they're actually working with a very similar playbook in this period. So it's called Blitzkrieg now, but on the Soviet side it's referred to as deep operations or deep battle. Mikhail Tukhachevsky is really the theorist there. But what happens, again, with the purges, Tukhachevsky's arrested for having contacts with the Germans. This is the reason he's tried. And his manual is actually banned because of his connections to Germany. So all of the doctrine, the playbook, they have the German playbook, and they suppress it in the course of the purges, and they arrest all of the officers who knew it. So they lost in that exchange.
Yes?
You mentioned the fact that, according to your findings, there was a sort of development of blitzkrieg tactics on the Soviet side because of the contact between the two general staffs during the interwar period. But honestly, by reading Mark Harrison, I found out quite the opposite. The fact that after the purges, the idea of offensive at all costs took the place to strategic retreat. That's, I don't know if you knew about it, but basically after the purges, where there were many generals that were they could accept to retreat strategically, losing ground to German troops while they were advancing. After the purges, the new carriers of the Soviet Union army was not ready to accept anything of that sort, so they wanted to pursue the offensive at all costs.
Yeah, so essentially of the core theorists, basically all of the major Soviet theorists in the interwar period up to 36 are studying or living for extended periods in Germany. So Isserson, who's the one survivor of the purges at the senior level, he lives in Germany for something like 8 months studying with the German general staff. And their ideas, they look a lot like the German ones. They're very much about offensive maneuver, deep battle, again, aims for penetrations of about 50 miles at a time, so these big sweeping envelopments, the kind of things that the Germans would be really good at in the Second World War. The Soviets, this is one of the debates, and something I think Mark Harrison does terrifically, asks, well, could the Soviets really have pulled this off? Did they have the officer corps, the cadres, the technology, the coordination to actually do this in the face of combat? Maybe not, but I think even in reacting, they probably would have been a lot more successful than what the Soviet officer corps ended up doing, which was essentially this static defense, positioned far too close to the Polish border when the war began. I think that with those trained cadres, they would have done far better.
Yeah, well, they lacked motorization for doing any kind of maneuver that could withstand.
They had far more tanks than the Germans when the war began, and aircraft. But
yes, at the back there.
Thanks very much, really fascinating. Two questions for me. The first, I was interested by your comments about the black fund that the German military had for the Nazi candidates. How does that kind of square with the German military's distaste for the SA and then the SFs? Was it just a case that they completely misjudged the Nazis, and as many argue? And the second question would be, what was the kind of operational impact this had during the Second War on the Eastern Front? Was it a case that these factories were bombed pretty quickly after, because they obviously knew where the sites were and everything? And is that why the Russian industry moved so far to the east during the war?
So I'll take those in reverse order. So the Soviet evacuation military industry happens almost immediately. It's one of the few things they do really well in the first 2 weeks of the war. They begin disassembling thousands of factories and moving them east. They moved 25 million workers, more or less, east over the course of the first year of the campaign. The Germans may have taken advantage of all of these factories that they helped develop, most of which were along the southern Volga and in eastern Ukraine, but they were largely gone by the time there was a real possibility of using strategic bombing against them. And what was the first question again?
About the German military's distaste for the SA.
Yes. Yeah, so the German military, again, hubris is a word that I think comes to mind looking at a lot of these officers. So Kurt von Schleicher, who's essentially von Zech's successor after 1926 in terms of his political influence, thinks that he can kind of pull one over on the Nazis, that they're controllable. And this leads to his miscalculations in 1932, which lead to Hitler coming to power. So I think there's this thought that really the Nazis are controllable and that they can be moderated or manipulated by the government. One anecdote I would add about the black funds, which I found quite interesting. So most of the funds came from the sales of weapons that were banned by the Treaty of Versailles, the things Germany had claimed that it destroyed after the First World War. The particularly successful branch at selling all this illicit military equipment was the Navy. But they put I believe a 27-year-old in charge, whose dad happened to be an influential political figure. And in order to raise money for these various illegal projects in the Soviet Union, he basically went on a spending spree. He bought a film studio. He bought a company that manufactured bacon that supposedly had this special spice that would appeal to British tastes and thus take over the pork monopoly importing to the UK. Did a bunch of bizarre things, trying to turn potatoes into gasoline. They probably shouldn't have put him in charge of the funds. But interestingly, so he's connected to these funds going to various political candidates. He gets busted when he does two things. He starts making propaganda films at this movie studio, making the Navy look really good, to a place where no one goes to see the movies, and so the studio goes bankrupt. And then it turns out that he's got a Russian mistress that he's picked up during his visits to the Soviet Union, who he tries to get a big film deal, turn her into a film star. She's not very good, and it ends up being a tax evasion case that comes out of this, and the whole thing comes crumbling down in the late 20s with a bunch of different revelations. And after that, they tighten up a little bit in terms of funding to the right-wing candidates. But kind of an interesting anecdote, how the money's actually getting there, I think.
Talking about anecdotes, I was wondering if you could say a bit more about Enver Pasha, who you talked about at the beginning, as someone who's an optimist. I was fascinated to hear about Pasha. He's obviously the person who's a major architect of German-Ottoman alliance in 1914, but his story within this is a fascinating one. And so, can you say a bit more about what happens to him and where he ends up going, and why he's the person, this sort of Ottoman figure who's playing such a major role in German-Soviet relations?
Yeah. So after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, the senior military figures, the leadership, have to go underground because they're not the Turkish military, the nationalists are not big fans of them. And Pasha has a bounty on his head because he's a war criminal. And so he goes underground in Germany because he'd been very closely tied to German military leadership during the war. And so they decide they'll trust him to go to Moscow because he's not going to turn himself in to the British or French. He's a safe character. And in addition, he thinks that he can actually get Soviet funding to help bring him back to power in Turkey. The way he's going to do this is by negotiating this big arms deal. The Turkish government will be happy enough that they'll invite him back with open arms, and it's going to restore his political fortunes. So he tries to get to Moscow from Germany 3 times. First time, the plane crash. Second time, he's on a train that derails. Not great fortune. He's arrested in this case as well, but manages to escape. And the third time, he does, in fact, manage to get there. And when he gets there, he passes all of this along, all the information from the German side. He's talking to Trotsky quite closely. There are telegrams flying back and forth. He does his job for a while, and then he disappears. And he'd been in the midst of this arms negotiation with the Soviets that wasn't going particularly well, and the Soviets are surprised that he's just gone. He's not in Moscow. Well, he turns up in Central Asia. He proclaims that he is the new caliph and tries to raid an army of Islamic faithful to take over Central Asia. It takes about 18 months for the Soviets to track him down and kill him, but he raises a pretty significant army and fights them off for a while. So he has a bit of an adventure after the training.
Some great characters in this story. Any further questions? Let's just hear it, Ashley.
You commented at the beginning that the secret alliance worked to militarise both societies, and you commented how, for example, for German officers seeing the effects of the famine may have turned them against the Soviet regime. Do you think there was something working on the Soviet side and to turn them similarly against the Germans?
You know, it's an interesting question. To what effect their contact to the Germans changed their political outlooks? Only very senior Soviet officers were allowed to go to Germany. The numbers are usually between 50 and 60 a year, either in disguise or some kind of surreptitiously. So there isn't this huge wave of officers heading west as there is heading east. Most of these officers, again, they're going to be purged, and the idea is that their political attitudes have been corrupted by their experience with the Germans. And I don't particularly see them becoming, they may in fact become more anti-communist as a result of these efforts. So there's a scandal in about 1934 where one of these generals supposedly defects, and he says, if we have to go to war with Germany, we're going to kill Stalin and take over the government and rebuild our alliance. And there's a question whether this is an NKVD ploy to try to get some of these guys out of the woodwork, but in any case, that attitude is in fact there among some Soviet officers. So it's having an impact on their political attitudes, but maybe not in the way Stalin would want.
Yes.
Just a short question, a bit similar to what you say, but you said that there was a sort of feeling among the Germans that they would perhaps end up going to war with the Soviets. Was it similar for the Soviets? Were they expecting like one day we may, this kind of attitude that we're cooperating, but in fact both knew that one day they would there would be a clash between both countries?
Yes, I think there is an awareness. So their personal relations are actually very friendly for the most part, especially at the smaller facilities, the tank and chemical weapons facilities. They're having parties together, they're drinking together, they're eating together, they're becoming very close. There's exchanges of gifts after officers leave. At the same time, they talk a little bit about the potential of future war. My understanding is for the first 10 or so years of cooperation, so 22 to 32, they kind of try to avoid it at social events. But by 33, there's a clear sense that they're a foreboding that some of this is in fact coming. And one sign of this, I think, throughout this period, that really there's never firm trust, at least at the decision-making level, is the fact that the Soviets, in every document, the phrase they use for the Germans is "druzia," friends, but it's always in quotation marks. For 20 years, they put it in quotation marks.
Yes.
Yeah, two things. Do you think any of the relationships that were formed during that period, sort of 1926 through to 1936, led to some of the sentiments that existed in Die Schwarze Kapelle, the Harek Schulze boys and layman contacts with the Russians that developed? Because it's difficult to sort of see why they suddenly developed an affinity towards the Russians. Do you know if they were any part of the officer exchange, and also in terms of the future development of the Soviet industrial military complex? Basically, their level of automation subsequently was much better and much more efficient than what was taking place in Germany, right up until Speer came in 1942.
Yes, in fact, the Soviets are producing more with less, really up until that point. And part of that is that they go to a total war footing, and they're fully mobilizing their labor pool. The Germans weren't willing to use women, limited work hours because of social and political concerns. So I think there were a number of things going on there. But I think the Soviets had learned a lot of the industrial techniques from both Germany and from the United States. So the U.S., after German cooperation begins to fade, it's the United States that's sending engineers to work on every one of these industrial projects. It's filling in at these munitions plants in the Soviet Union. In terms of connections to the Soviet Union, I haven't seen direct connections of that sort. One thing that is interesting, I think, is that there are a number of German officers who, if you trace their stories throughout this period, so there's a lieutenant colonel whose papers I have, and he's commanding a equivalent of an armor brigade on the Eastern Front, and he has a nervous breakdown after he witnesses an army unit actually. They drive a bunch of peasants into a church and set it on fire in Ukraine fairly early in the campaign, and he has a nervous breakdown and requests to transfer out of combat duties. He spoke fluent Russian. My understanding is he translated some Russian poetry. So this cultural experience of being in and out of the Soviet Union for years clearly did have a political impact the other way on a number of officers who came to appreciate and really admire Russian culture and everything else. And he survived the war. He was not punished in any way for asking to transfer away from the front, but clearly that impacted his political sentiments.
Yes, to the back here.
To what extent, if at all, did the victorious Allies have a clue about what was going on?
It's an interesting question. So I've worked in the Polish archives as well as Q here, which is a terrific place to work. A fair amount. In fact, this enterprising Manchester Guardian reporter, he actually writes a book in 1931 called The Russian Face of Germany. And he doesn't know about all the different bases, but he's got a sense that there's this massive rearmament program taking place in Germany, or in the Soviet Union, on behalf of Germany. And what's amazing is his own newspaper pans the book. They say, this all came out in the 20s. Germany's not doing this anymore. Stresemann sorted the Germans out. This is all conspiracy theories and garbage. Everything in the book is more or less accurate. At an intelligence level, it's clear the governments know what's going on. The Poles have a pretty good sense, and they're relaying information to the West. Why don't the governments do anything? It's a lack of political will. There's actually a sentiment I've seen among a number of British officers that really Germany has the right to at least partially rearm, that we treated them a little unfairly under Versailles. One of the inspectors actually runs across some of this secret rearmament stuff. He's a British inspector, and he basically winks at the Germans and tells them to proceed with the inspection when he discovers they're producing illicit materials. So again, it's a badly kept secret, but if the terms of Versailles had really been enforced, world history looks very different, I think.
Yes.
Just sorry, I think a second ago. You mentioned about the effect of Chernyshevsky getting shot and the effect and his doctrine of armed warfare being thrown to one side. I think it must have been a long-term, quite insidious effect, because as I understand it, there were 3 million Russian soldiers in their armed corps and their armed regiment, and 2 million of them who were killed in action. And a big chunk of that must be the ability to handle large formations against equally large formations who are better at it than they were. Is that a fair observation, do you think?
Absolutely. So, there's been a lot of really great research that's been done on the purges since the Soviet archives became accessible. And we've learned that the purges were actually much smaller in scale than we initially thought. That a lot more officers were simply kicked out of the party or removed from their positions rather than shot. But the ones who are shot are all of the competent officers who are really good at coordinating large armored formations in particular. So the Navy and armored forces are the ones that are particularly hard hit in the purges. And I think it clearly affects how they deploy operationally during the war.
Thank you.
Yes.
Let's go back very briefly to that question on hubris on the part of the German army. Was there any disdain in the fact that Hitler had just been a corporal in the First World War, yeah, we can handle it? Was that perhaps part of the war?
Yeah, so what I noticed very much, I got to look at the memoirs and letters of a lot of German officers in this period of cooperation. And there's a real break between the individuals who are in the pre-World War I German army. Those officers are dismissive of Hitler. Again, what's great is I have KGB records, or what later is called the KGB, records on all of these guys. And so I can see their political transformation over years and years of coming to Russia. The senior officers are generally anti-Nazis. This is the folks actually running these facilities. The people who are very enthusiastically pro-Nazi are people who were essentially brought into the German army during the war, or who are these 17, 18, 19-year-olds afterwards. So the attitude is clearly there. And what's quite interesting is Hitler conducts his own purge of the German military in the 30s, where he removes a lot of these senior officers who are disdainful of him, particularly in 1938. So there's a very stark partition there in terms of attitudes.
I was asked one final question. You were talking about the Allies and the British and the Polish perspective. I was thinking about, what about the French? You've obviously got Marshal Foch saying after Versailles that this is an armistice for 20 years. How much do the French know about this? And I'd imagine their intelligence is, well, their concerns are going to be greater than the British side. And do they have much information? Is there much in public discourse in France on this?
Some, yeah. So my impression is the French are much more dedicated to maintaining German disarmament. The Germans are in fact very worried throughout their period of cooperation that old historic ties between Russia and France, as in the First World War, are going to undermine the alliance, that the fact that Soviets might be selling their technology and information to the French. But my sense is that the French were not willing to react to information they were getting about violations of Versailles without British acquiescence, and that was not forthcoming.
Any final questions?
When does the book come out?
It's I think it's scheduled for January of next year. So it's done. We're just in marketing right now.
And just one final question here. Last question.
How is this today remembered on both sides, either in the military and also in the civilian society?
So in Germany, I don't think it's particularly well remembered. It's quite easy to access materials, though. It's actually under German federal law. All of the archives I went to, these corporate archives, they have to show me anything from the interwar period related to armament. So I think there are professional historians who have a sense of this, but not in public discourse. In the Soviet Union, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia very slowly came to terms with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was not officially acknowledged until 1989. And even now, this is a very delicate, sensitive subject. The Second World War has such a huge place in Russian historical memory. Understandably, 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war. This is a sensitive subject, I think I was very careful when I would go into the archives in terms of what I was saying I was looking at, and I think that's still necessary.
Well, great, and delighted to hear the book will be coming out soon. I know it's going to be something which a lot of people are going to be desperate to read, and it's fantastic you've given us an insight into it here. So thank you very much, Ian.
Thank you.